President Donald Trump continues to take aim at the nation's election security infrastructure, despite a lack of proof of widespread fraud.
Tonight, I'm announcing the immediate declassification and release of critical intelligence revealing shocking vulnerabilities in our election infrastructure.
NewsEdge is breaking down what it means for voters as a critical midterm election inches closer. And that's where we begin tonight. Thanks so much for joining us here on NewsEdge. I'm Christine Spiro. The president has continued to claim the 2020 election was stolen, but has failed to produce examples of major voter fraud. Tonight, he revealed dozens of documents he claims showed a coordinated effort of foreign adversaries to tilt elections, but those documents do not back up the president's claims that any interference swung elections. NewsEdge reporter Christopher King has been poring over those releases. He joins us here on set with a breakdown of what we learned today and what we didn't.
Well, Christine, President Donald Trump says those documents show, quote, areas of concern in election security. The Trump administration's website went live a short time ago. The president used his speech to raise doubts about the security of the nation's elections. The president has continued to claim the 2020 election was rigged against him, this despite providing no proof of those claims. He falsely claimed widespread voter fraud and foreign interference, this in contradiction of the evidence. The president's speech did not produce evidence. Votes were manipulated. The election results were altered. He warned about flaws in the voting system. He said he's releasing documents related to 2020 and 2018. That's when he lost the presidential election and Republicans lost the midterms. The president focused on China, but documents the White House provided tonight show China attempted to target former Vice President Joe Biden's campaign, not Trump's. The document also says the interference did not sway the outcome of the election. The president glossed over Russia. Intelligence officials under his first term said Russia engaged in wide-ranging influence campaigns aimed at helping him in 2016 and again in 2020. A judge Trump appointed here in Georgia ruled against an ally of the president who tried to overturn those 2020 results. The people President Trump appointed at the Justice Department, cybersecurity, and intelligence agencies found the 2020 election was free and fair. They found there was no evidence of foreign interference, but President Trump said there was foreign interference. Take a listen.
Over a period of years, starting during the 2020 election cycle, the People's Republic of China carried out what is believed to be the largest compromise of election data in history, resulting in China's illicit acquisition of 220 million U.S. voter files. That information includes names, addresses, phone numbers, political party preferences, and other sensitive data that would be needed to register to vote and engage in other nefarious activities. The cover-up of this colossal security breach is even more disturbing in light of the additional information showing that China engaged in other election-related activities to undermine my first administration and our 2020 campaign.
The president also claimed there are more than 270,000 non-citizens who are illegally registered to vote in California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Nevada. The Department of Homeland Security says nearly 2,600 non-citizens are registered here in Georgia. But as recently as 2024, Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger found that number was just under 20 people, 20 in total. The 2024 audit also revealed only 9 of those non-citizens actually voted in a Georgia election. Those votes were all cast prior to the new citizenship verification systems implemented in 2012. Raffensperger says he referred those cases to local prosecutors. We asked the Secretary of State's office for a comment. We also spoke with local political analysts on both sides of the aisle about the president's speech. Stephen Lawson is a Republican. Andre Washington is a Democrat. Here's what they say.
I think it's probably a mixed bag. I think it's in the eye of the beholder. I think if you thought that there were issues with the 2020 election before, I think you certainly are going to have more reason to believe that. And if you were skeptical about President Trump's allegations and believe that the 2020 election was free and fair, I don't think anything he said tonight is going to sway your opinion.
He regurgitated statements that have been widely debunked, but most of all, he made statements that call into question the integrity of the election. Now, that can do two different things. On the one hand, it can suppress Republican voter turnout because if they don't trust the system, why participate in it? On the other hand, it can energize Democrats who say we must win in November in such convincing margins so as to not allow the president to step in and say there was some form of cheating or there was some form of inconsistency.
The president also urged Congress to pass the SAVE Act that would require voters to prove they are U.S. citizens in order to register to vote in federal elections. Supporters say it would strengthen election integrity, but critics say there are already safeguards in place. They also say the proposal would create new hurdles for eligible voters.